We can go ahead and get things started. So first off, thank you everyone so much for joining us for today's webinar, analyzing the 2024 election results, implications for the House, Senate, and beyond, featuring experts from Holland and Knight. My name is Aditya Kamanduri, or I go by AK as well. I'm an enterprise customer account executive here at Quorum. Very excited to dive into what these results mean for both the legislative and the policy landscapes moving forward, and we're joined by some powerhouses in the industry today. We're going to focus first on the House of Representatives for the first 30 minutes, and then we will move on to Senate. So that's how we will split this webinar. Start with the House first, move on to Senate. But first, few housekeeping items that we should cover. The session will be recorded and shared afterwards. So if you miss anything, don't worry, we will make sure we send the recording over. And second, and most importantly, we want this to be a very interactive session. Please feel free to use the chat on the right side. And there is also a tab for Q&A where you can submit your questions there. One of the things that we love doing most is asking people to upvote other participants' questions too, in the spirit of an election results webinar. And in the spirit of democracy, we want you to figure out and talk and upvote the types of content, questions, and result analysis that we can help with. So first, let's start with the House. I'm joined by two wonderful, distinguished experts from the Holland and Knight team to discuss outcomes in the House. First, we will start with Catherine Lehman. Catherine brings unmatched expertise in navigating the inner workings of Congress with a pretty robust background that includes serving as Chief of Staff for the House Republican Conference and counsel roles on the House Judiciary Committee. Catherine has been at the forefront of shaping legislative and political strategy for over 15 years. Beyond her legislative acumen, Catherine has also championed equality and inclusion through her advocacy and legal work, and we are very excited and honored that Catherine gave us our time here. Second, we have Carl Koch. Carl serves as a senior policy advisor at Holland and Knight's Tampa office, bringing decades of experience in legislative and executive branch operations. Having worked as chief of staff to Congressman Jim Davis and a campaign strategist for high-profile races, including the Clinton-Gore presidential reelection campaign, Carl provides a really nuanced perspective on the dynamics of congressional races and their implications for governance. So first off, Catherine, Carl, thank you so much for your time today. We're really excited for this conversation. And thank you for being here. Let's begin our discussion. We will first talk high level about a couple House-related questions, but on the right-hand side, I think I want to let the audience know, please feel free to bump in any questions here, talk through questions around key takeaways from the 2024 House races. So I think the first place, Catherine and Carl, we can start is by, AP has basically called a Republican securing majority in the House, right? So with Republicans essentially securing a majority in the House, how do you see this influencing legislative priorities in areas like healthcare, immigration, and environmental policy? And maybe as a bit of an addendum to that question, what strategies do you think public affairs professionals can use to maybe align their advocacy efforts with the anticipated legislative agenda? So first, we'll talk about what big changes you see in these areas. And then second, any tips you can offer public affairs professionals. Whoever wants to start, the floor is yours.
Well, I'll start, and I'll start by doing a classic. I'm going to answer the question I want to answer, not the question that you asked. First of all, thanks for having us. We really appreciate it. I do want to start with, I don't think anybody really expected Republicans to keep the House. Sometimes you're going in, you're like, oh, we're going to be great. We're going to be great. We were a little gun shy after 2022 when everybody thought there would be a red wave, and Republicans really just barely hung on to the House by a very narrow majority. This time, as you know, I think we are at 218. There's probably half a dozen races to be called. I think the numbers where the Democrats lead, so how do I put this? There's two seats that will probably flip, maybe three. I think we probably pick up the Alaska seat where Nick Begich is running against Mary Peltola, except I have to say, if he doesn't get to 50%, they go to ranked choice voting, and so that could complicate things a little bit. Michelle Steele's race in California is, who's a great member, is tight and getting tighter. And then in Oregon 5, I don't think that's been called yet, but Lori Chavez Dreamer, again, a great member, Republican, unfortunately, looks like she is going to lose to the Democrat. So as I like to say, we spent millions, billions of dollars, and we end up pretty much exactly where we were. Carl, do you want to talk about election results at all?
Yeah, again, I'll start out by saying thank you again, AK, for having us today. We appreciate the time. Catherine, as much as I hate to admit it, is pretty much dead on in her initial analysis. I mean, obviously, the Republicans are already at 218 races that have been called. They're going to hang on to the majority. There's 9, I think, still out there, Catherine. The question, I think, in my mind, as Catherine kind of alluded to, is, are we talking 222 seats for Republicans, 223? But I think 223 is probably their ceiling, because again, Democrats will flip the Oregon seat, hang on to a couple of other seats that are very close right now and still are in the game, and a couple of those California races. So there still could be a couple of surprises here. Peltola has pulled this out in the past when it comes to ranked choice voting, so I'm still optimistic there. As long as Begich stays below 50 and she can get to ranked choice, she's proven she's very strong when that happens. So,
but you had Sarah Palin in last time, so I think
no doubt about it. No doubt about it. And the candidate in third place right now apparently is pretty far right. So it's unlikely that those second choice votes would go to Peltola, but you never know. She is well liked. She's well respected. Getting to ranked choice for her is the best possible outcome, and would be, the one path she has to victory still.
Yes.
I do think going forward, I mean, not much is going to change in the House, except for the fact the president's going to change. And that does change everything in terms of priorities, in terms of legislation, in terms of how things go forward. And we will have to wait and see how the president and Speaker Johnson kind of negotiate that. But especially on the House Democratic side, you're not going to see many changes. Our leadership's going to stay the same. Committee structures are going to stay the same. You'll have some ranking members on subcommittees that change, but overall, very minor changes. Those elections will be Tuesday of next week, and it's going to be kind of Hakeem Jeffries and his team, the same we had in this last Congress, in this current Congress, I should say.
And I think that's a
All right,
really
I'm going to address one more question. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Catherine, please.
No, I was going to address one more question that we're getting in the chat, and then we'll get to your question, which was a great question. Just wasn't ready for it yet. And that is talking about, it's noteworthy that the president-elect has named a lot of House members. I mean, I won't say a lot, but there's a steady stream of House Republicans. Michael Waltz, for one, Elise Stefanik for UN ambassador, and with a very, very tight margin, it's concerning. And then, of course, yesterday, Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, which, as I described, was like setting off an atomic bomb in the middle of Washington. And I wasn't even here. I was in North Carolina, and it was still like an atomic bomb went out. But anyway, I think what they probably do, they've already announced there will be a special election, I think on January 3rd for the Get seat. Obviously, it's a very Republican, very, very Republican district. It's Florida. Carl knows that. I think they will probably end up staggering the retirements to make sure that they're down as few people, not the retirements, but the resignations, looking at how they're going to go through the Senate and the timing of going through the Senate, to make sure that they don't fall below 218. As far as getting things done, in the past couple of years, the Freedom Caucus has always been a thorn in whoever's side. It was a thorn in Speaker McCarthy's side, bit of a thorn in Speaker Johnson's side. But with Trump as president, he is their leader. And I fully expect them to do, the Freedom Caucus as a whole, to do whatever President Trump wants them to do. And so The bigger challenge, I think, will be some of the members in moderate districts, some of whom hung on, like a Don Bacon, for example. And I do say hung on, Don Bacon. I don't think Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania's race was ever in doubt. But it's as I always say, and I have been told for years, moderates make the majority. You need those moderates to get you above 218, regardless of which party you're in. So I think in a way, the House will have it a little easier than the Senate, which we'll get to in a bit. The House is more of a majoritarian, runs by the majority with the Rules Committee. And then as far as your question, which I'm going to get to, AK, which is how do you align your priorities? I think, you really got to look at where is the Trump administration going to be either rolling back regulations with or issuing executive orders or pushing legislation on immigration, permitting, I think helping oil, favoritism towards oil and gas versus renewables. I think they're going to come out of the box fairly early with trying to extend the tax cuts from 2017 and doing the reconciliation process, which we all know only needs 51 votes in the Senate. So there's going to be all kinds of opportunities. I actually think this Congress is, on a policy level, is likely to be more robust than the last Congress was. But I'm curious what Carl thinks about that.
No, I think that's absolutely the case because the Republicans control all the levers now, right? I mean, everything. And they've got a Supreme Court who is highly unlikely to overturn anything they pass at this point, too. So they control the whole gamut here. I think they have to wait and see what the president wants to do, what the president-elect wants to do in terms of ordering priorities. I think we know what some of those orders, what that order is going to be. But when you control everything, whether it's through reconciliation or some of this other procedures, I think you're going to see some stuff move relatively quickly, and you've seen we'll find out where the chips fall. I will say, as a House Democrat, I would certainly encourage the president-elect to continue to appoint Republicans from the House into his administration. Another 7 or 8 would be great, but assuming that won't happen, we'll just go from there.
We'll let them know. I think that 7 or 8 would be really spectacular for a lot of House Democrats. They're eagerly anticipating, and I think even with former Representative Zeldin's appointment to the EPA, I think the House appointments, are a pretty big focus right now. And I think a little shift on that kind of side of things, right? So huge shifts in committee leadership, particularly influential committees, Ways and Means and Judiciary. From an engagement perspective, when a lot of these changes may be a little bit incendiary, like Catherine said, dropping an atomic bomb in the middle of Washington, D.C., any tips for professionals, public affairs professionals, as they think about how to start reaching out and building relationships with new key influential committee leadership?
Well, I think you're actually not going to see a lot of change. I think Jason Smith is at Ways and Means. Jim Jordan is at Judiciary. There will be change at House Financial Services Committee because Patrick Henry retired. That's a big one to watch. Education Committee. I don't think Representative Virginia Foxx gets another waiver. And at the Rules Committee. And then Energy and Commerce. Big fight at Energy and Commerce between Congressman Latta of Ohio and Brett Guthrie of Kentucky. That's probably the biggest one. That and financial services are probably the biggest one to watch. For the Rules Committee, the Speaker appoints whoever's going to be the chairman of the Rules Committee, so that's not voted on by the Steering Committee. A couple minor notes. I've read that there's been some dust. So the Steering Committee is a collection of members. I don't know how the Democrats do it for the Republicans. They kind of divide up the country by regions and get a vote, and then I think the speaker gets 5 votes, and then everybody gets a number of votes. There was some consternation I read yesterday about the steering committee, that the way they mashed the regions together, people weren't happy about that. So I think that will probably be resolved today. I'm going to just jump to a question in the chat. I read, I think this morning, that they amended the motion to vacate to require 9 members as opposed to 1 member. You recall that is, I have described that as one of the most anti-democratic things in Washington, D.C., allowing 1 member to take out the Speaker of the House. So I think gives Speaker Johnson a bit of breathing room going forward, that it doesn't just take 1 member to muck things up. And I think Republicans, even though it was over a year ago, are still a little bit bruised by however many days it took them to get a new speaker, and I don't think they want to go through that again. So.
And Catherine, I would think for Speaker Johnson too, the fact that he has for now the support of the president-elect, I mean, is also somewhat insulating him in terms of any challenges.
Yeah. All right, so we answered Deanne's question. I'm very happy that we answered somebody's question. Anyway, all right, more questions or more thoughts.
And we love the questions coming in, by the way. Both of you are absolutely crushing it. The Q&A is flooding with new questions. So we'll move down and take a break from our questions to have some audience questions next. Next, we have Adam Haley asking, what are the prospects for WIOA, or the Workplace Innovation Act, I believe, in the next Congress? If we don't want to dive too specific into the policy details yet, we certainly don't have to, but I think it's an interesting question that seems to have a lot of attention from the audience here. So not sure if that's one of you prefers to weigh in on, but curious to hear your take.
So Catherine, I'll take first of this as the Democrat on this panel, but I mean, I think for almost anything we're talking about now outside of reconciliation, you don't know. We don't know. We don't know because the president-elect just has not completely formed the team that's going to work with congressional leadership in terms of what priorities are going to be. Committees will still be doing their jobs, clearly. There still will be hearings, but in terms of floor time, I think a lot of this is going to be to be determined in January.
I am not an expert on WIOA, and honestly, I'm glad you told me what the acronym means, AK, because I didn't know. That being said, I do want to say President Trump announced a Department of Government Efficiency headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. I don't know why I'm choking on his name. I don't think it's going to be a real department. I think it's going to make recommendations by July 4th, 2026, and they have instructions to cut, several $1 billion in government spending. One of the recommendations, which I think has been in the Republican platform since the 80s, is to get rid of the Department of Education. I don't mean to be skeptical, but I don't see Republicans getting rid of the Department of Education. But God knows I've been surprised before in the last couple of days. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I do want to say, though, that is something that all that, it's great to say you're going to cut waste. It always seems very simple, but obviously every program has constituents and people that are invested in it. And the other thing that's interesting about that effort is at some point Congress needs to deal with those recommendations. Although I think the lawyers in this administration are perfectly happy to set up a fight over the Budget Act of 1974, which I'm just starting to learn about, which deals with when the president can and cannot decide to fund things. So we may be looking at a bit of I don't want to say a constitutional, I'm not going to say a meltdown, but a conflict, and somewhat of an institutional conflict between the president and Congress when they go to get rid of some of these programs or cut some of these spending programs. So that's something to keep an eye on as well.
And do you think that's like the same kind of approach here for, as Carl was mentioning, a bit of we don't know until January? I think that kind of hints to a couple other questions in the chat about more specific issues, things from Medicare and Medicaid to the farm bill to like tax bills. How widespread is that wait and see approach, or do you think because of a lot of the rhetoric around balancing budgets, cutting government spending with the Doge department, that's going to be a more clear answer than the rest of the maybe more niche or nuanced policy issues?
Well, I think they've been working on a tax bill. Republicans have been working on a tax bill for several months now. So I think they're going to be ready to roll that out fairly quickly. And then, of course, because you only need 51 votes in the Senate, people try and stick as much stuff in there as they can. Obviously, because of the Byrd rule, it has to have a direct budgetary impact, which people will learn more about the Byrd rule than that it's not outside in the Robins. It's an actual spending thing that they ever wanted to. So I think we know tax reform will happen. As far as like these other issues, I do think the committees will get to work on them, but I also think that to the extent that this administration doesn't try and do everything on their own. Now, let me just say one thing. As far as nominees go in the Senate, I believe you only need 51 votes now to push a nominee through. The Senate people were more expert on that than I am. I'm sure it seemed like a good idea when Democrats were trying to push their nominees through and they were having trouble doing it. There have been calls, in last several years from either Republicans or Democrats, we need to get rid of the filibuster rule. As much as I am a House person, I will say I don't want the House and the Senate to be the same. I think that is a safeguard that is essential to keeping democracy going. Is that a good way to put it? But one other point I want to make, when Biden has been president, there's been a lot of calls for, well, just do everything by executive order and do as much as you can by executive order. And honestly, that's the kind of thing that comes back to bite you, because, you wanted President Biden to have the authority or to make use of those authorities. Well, now you have President Trump, who will make use of those executive authorities. And I honestly think his lawyers will be pushing the envelope of some of those on some of those issues. So that's going to eat up a lot of the oxygen, I think, in Washington. Sort of the, what are they trying to do? Can they do that? Will the Supreme Court stop them? Will the Senate step up to put some guardrails in? So I don't. But I do think also that some of these, I don't want to call them lesser issues, but some of these issues that aren't on the front page and aren't the drama and the light and the fury will get done. I know by the end of the year, they need to do something on appropriations. It's not clear if that happens, if they do a CR until a year-long CR, a CR next spring, or just get everything done so that the table is cleared for President Trump to come in with his priorities next spring. That kind of remains to be seen.
And I think on top of that, Catherine, obviously the CR, the appropriations piece is going to be huge, and that's a very hard deadline at this point. But you also have the debt ceiling coming into play in January. And what's going to be interesting to watch play out on that is it's early January when it's supposed to expire. It'll have to be the Biden Treasury that institutes the extraordinary measures necessary to keep the government open, assuming there is no debt ceiling extension, and I think that's a safe assumption. But the Biden Treasury Department would have to take those extraordinary measures and then leave those for the Trump administration to either continue executing or figure out a way out of this on their own. So there's a lot in play here that still has to, and you've got some tax extenders that expire at the end of the year too. So there is still a lot that this Congress is going to have to address. Whether they kick the can or not, we'll have to see. My guess is kicking the can is the easiest option, but you've still got a Democratic majority in the Senate that Todd will talk about that, may not be willing to walk away as quietly as some people want them to.
Yeah. And they also want to get NDAA done.
And
then I've heard Schumer's picking around something on AI. Not sure how much of an appetite there is for that, but it should be an interesting couple of weeks. And of course, the CR expires on December 20th, in theory, to put some pressure on people to try to do something before they, so they can go home for Christmas. which is an admirable goal. So I'm not really sure. I think they're waiting to see what President-elect Trump wants to do in terms of the CR, how long it lasts, and when does it go.
We have a couple minutes left with Catherine and Carl. So last call here for questions. I know we have a lot, and there will be, unfortunately, some that we don't get to. Promise it's not that they're not important. We just have to make sure that we get to as many as we can, while Catherine and Carl have wonderfully and graciously offered us their time. One of the ones that has a bunch of upvotes on the Q&A side of things is, I think, a topic that we talk about almost every election cycle, and it's that of political polarization, right? Every election, that first couple of weeks after presidentially, I think we see a lot of fervor on both sides. Do you see a potential for more bipartisan collaboration and legislation as a way to kind of go beyond this tribalistic state that we're in right now? Or do you think that's kind of a lost cause at this point?
All right, so I'm going to take the first crack at this, Catherine, and I'm going to say, do I see a potential for more bipartisan collaboration? The answer to that is no, at least not in the short term. And the reason I say that, quite honestly, is because reconciliation, we know, is going to get used to do tax reform and tax extensions and lots of other policy. And if there's one thing that we've seen over and over and over again, reconciliation is by itself a polarizing exercise, whether it's Democrats doing it, whether it's Republicans doing it, because the other side gets left out completely. So no, I don't think anything changes, at least in the first quarter of next year, in terms of Congress functioning, only because I think reconciliation will get in the way of any progress that can get made.
And I don't disagree with that at all. I do think, do I think there's going to be a sudden outburst of bipartisanship? No. Do I think that some of the issues that have been raised in the Q&A about water or the Farm Bill or education, sort of I don't want to say bread and butter issues, but they're kind of Congress bread and butter issues. Again, not necessarily headline issues until they come to a head, but things that need to get done. You need to set policy on those issues. I think the committees will continue to work on those issues. I don't expect it to be particularly bipartisan, but there may be some areas where they can agree on what needs to be done. But no, I don't think we're going to have a kumbaya moment. And to be fair, when you win it all, it means that you have a chance to lose it all. And I don't mean to be negative about the House majority. Obviously, I want the House Republicans to be in the majority. But when you control it all and then people are not happy in 2 years, historically, the trend is that you lose seats. Not always, but historically, that is the trend. And I'm pretty sure the Senate had to defend the Senate Democrats had to defend a lot of seats. I don't want to lean into the Democrats, but the Democrats had to defend a lot of seats this cycle. I think that's flipped a bit for the next cycle in 2026. And so Republicans will be defending more seats. That's my guess, just because of the numbers. And so that may change the equation for 2026. Again, it's the members in the very red districts or the very blue districts probably won't have a problem unless they, are not conservative enough, and then they may get primaried. But it's the members in the moderate districts that really have to thread the needle. Now, one other thing I want to say about a tax bill, I think they want to try and get that done early, in reconciliation, and have it, really jumpstart the economy, because that's what most people voted on in this election was, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And the answer was, for a lot of people, was no. So they want to get the money out there, or have people keep their money as a way to show them that they've been able to make a change. And I think that's probably what Republicans will run on in 2026.
That's really well put, Catherine. We are at the end of time with both of you. I want to give you both an opportunity to give maybe last minute closing remarks, high level takeaways, things that you're looking forward to, things that you have your eye on as we head into the next year. There's a lot of wait and see here, but we would love any of your high-level takes, not necessarily related to a question, but what are you excited about? What are you focused on? Maybe 30 seconds from Catherine, 30 seconds from Carl, and then we promise we'll let you go. But thank
I'm going
you.
to let Carl go first. Carl, you go first. What are you excited about?
Happy to go first. Yeah, so as a Democrat, I'm looking forward to the midterms because midterms tend to go against the party in power. So that's I'm going to hang on for the next couple of years here. But I do think, in all seriousness, I mean, at least for House Democrats, you saw them operate in a very unified manner in this current Congress. Hakeem Jeffries stepped up to the challenge. He kept his Democrats together. I think that will continue into this next Congress. I think there will be some Democrats in red districts that we've seen before that are going to have to take some hard votes. And I think Republicans will probably be able to peel them off on certain issues if they try or want to. But I do think you'll see, again, a unified Democratic caucus. And what that means, the headache that creates for the speaker is if he starts to lose a couple of votes here and there, he needs Democrats to get across the finish line on some of these non-Freedom Caucus issues. So that's what I'm going to be watching.
What am I excited about? Well, I'm excited that Lisa McClain is now the conference chair. I think she's a good member. She's on the Armed Services. She's on like 4 committees, which is kind of crazy. And then Aaron Houchin, who is I think a sophomore member from Indiana, is going to be the conference secretary, I think. So we've got some good women in leadership sitting at the leadership table. The one thing I will say, I don't know that I'm excited about it, but it seems to me in 2016 when President Trump won, he didn't know he was going to win, and he didn't have people around him who particularly thought he was going to win, so he got off to a late start. That is not happening this time. He's got people around him that have really studied some of the issues. They're ready to make some challenges to how business is done in Washington. And I'm not saying I'm not excited about it, but it's going to be buckle up and a real challenge to the status quo.
A real challenge to the status quo is a good way to end this, because I think that's like a really good way to put it. And certainly the PG way. So, right. Catherine, Carl, thank you so much for your time here. I think the audience had a great time. Thank you so much. Next, we will move on to the Senate side of things. So we'll give Carl and Catherine a second here, and then we'll move on to the Senate side. Catch our breath for a few seconds. Awesome. So we are now joined by another pair of incredible, wonderful people here to offer their insights, takes, and answer your questions on the Senate side of things. So we're now moving the discussions on to Senate. For this portion, I'm joined by Dimitri Karakitsos and Todd Wooten. I'll say something about both of them really quickly, and then we'll let them have the floor to do this for the Senate side of things. So Dimitrios, he's a Holland and Knight partner based in Washington, D.C. Dimitrios specializes in developing legislative and executive branch strategies on pretty complex policy matters. He co-leads the firm's environment team and serves as the senior Senate Republican political liaison, coordinating the GOP leadership and committee chairs on issues critical to clients. Before joining Holland and Knight, Dimitrios was principal Senate drafter in negotiations for the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, the first major environmental legislation signed into law since 1990. So Dimitrios, very excited to have you and your expertise here. Next, Todd Wooten, also a partner in the Washington, D.C. office. Todd advises clients on legislative and regulatory issues related to technology, energy, and tax matters. He has been the internet blockchain technology, or he has been particularly active, rather, in representing technology companies and shaping policies surrounding the internet, blockchain technology, and AI, everyone's favorite topic of the year. Todd's extensive experience includes serving on 3 Senate committees for 4 senators, notably as senior counsel for energy and tax on the Senate Finance Committees. Dimitrios, Todd, Thank you so much for being here. Let's begin our discussion with both of your key insights and takeaways on how the Senate elections went. There's certainly a lot to talk about, especially with Senator Thune's election yesterday. But would love to have you quickly chime in on maybe high-level takeaways that you both saw from the Senate election, as I'm sure people have been paying attention to.
Sure. Thank you again for having us, and I'm happy to start. I think, as Catherine mentioned, it was a really tough election year for Senate Democrats, defending so many more seats, and also so many more seats in states that tend to lean a little bit redder. But states that voted for Donald Trump in 2020 and 2016, and some swing states. So we don't have to go through all of the results, obviously, but the key race pickups, were West Virginia, Montana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, I believe, but it's still somewhat pending. And I think Todd is well positioned to talk about that a little bit. And then, we had kind of three races that could have been, but did not end up materializing as very close on the Republican side, at least in Florida, Texas, and Nebraska. Leaving us with a 53 seat, most likely majority in the Senate, which I think is a pretty big deal because it gives a little bit of a buffer on, legislative priorities on nominees, certainly to Senate Republicans. You mentioned the Senate leadership elections yesterday. Obviously had three really good candidates vying to replace, Leader McConnell, who, I believe is the longest standing leader in Senate history. So big shoes to fill, a lot of experience there. Ultimately went with, I think, the choice that was the most expected. And I think a really strong choice in Senator Thune to lead the caucus going forward. The current whip for McConnell, the new whip, John Barrasso. Most of the leadership elections, other than the top right, which is pretty contested, weren't too contested. But we did have, one slight flip with Senator Cotton coming in for Senator Ernst. In the number 3 slot. So that's kind of where we stand from my perspective. I don't know if Todd wanted to talk about Pennsylvania or any of the other, key wins for the Democrats.
Well, I think, again, coming into the year, this was looking to be an incredibly tough cycle for Democrats. And, to a large degree, it was always going to be determined by what happened at the top of the ticket. A lot has been made of how the number of people who vote split ticket has gone down considerably in this particular period of polarization in American politics. Folks just don't do that as much anymore. So we knew that, this was going to be tough. To address Pennsylvania very quickly, there are 100,000 ballots which have not been counted. Some of those are mail from overseas. Some of those, I think 20,000 are mail from overseas. 80,000 are provisional. Republicans, rightfully and fairly, it's amazing that we have to say this, but we do, are challenging those provisional ballots, for various reasons, which are all incredibly legitimate. But Casey's down by about 30,000. And I think for John Fetterman, provisional ballots broke like 90% his way. And there's a belief that some of that overseas vote probably is a little bit tilted towards Casey as well. Either way, that's going to a runoff. If Democrats manage to pull that out, I would say that we had a pretty good night, all things considered. When you look at, losing every battleground state, and losing Sherrod Brown, John Tester, and Manchin, which in this scenario, in the scenario of what happened, we were never holding those seats. So if you're able to hold Casey, then that's a pretty good night. If we're not, then I'd say it was an okay night, because Slotkin won, Rosen won, Ruben Gallego won, any number of people who could have absolutely fallen, a Baldwin and won. We could have lost all those easily. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag. Obviously not the outcome that any Democrat wanted. And definitely because those senators won in places that Harris did not, a little bit soul searching, a little bit of, how did that happen going on. But I don't, there seems to be a desire to have all Dems kind of crushed and just, sitting around crying and just, whatever, not so much. Whenever you kind of look across the board in some of the places that we were able to hold these Senate seats, it gives us something to build on, and it gives us something to really look at to try and figure out what we can do better next time.
I think it's a great take, and I think like in one of the big topics of like the supposed like doom and gloom that a lot of the folks I think on the Democratic side have been feeling is cloture, right? So let's talk cloture, let's talk filibuster. I think that's one of the questions that everyone wants to get to right off the bat here. A lot of conversation about potentially eliminating the filibuster. Do we think that's actually going to happen as a way to ram initiatives through?
So certainly hope not. I think that there's long been pretty strong bipartisan support for maintaining it. You certainly saw that in the first Trump administration. I think there was a letter with a large portion of the Senate, both R&D, supporting maintaining the filibuster. Obviously, from my perspective, Democrats strayed from that a little bit in the Biden administration, and we're certainly open to it, at least from some potentially surgical, policy priority, ways of removing it. I was very heartened yesterday, I think, in Senator Thune's press conference following the vote. He was asked, will the legislative filibuster remain unchanged under your tenure? And he gave a one-word, unequivocal yes response. So I believe, again, Senator Thune is another kind of institutionalist like Senator McConnell was. I believe him. I believe he has every intention to keep it that way. Can we expect, it won't come up as an issue at some point, or the president, elect may not raise it later in frustration that, enough of his agenda isn't getting through? We may very well be having this conversation again, but I think for right now, it's safe, which I is really good for the Senate, really good for DC, and in my opinion, the country. As Catherine said, you don't really want both houses to be the same. And if you just have a simple majority in both, we're going to have pendulum swings. We're going to have kind of more extreme policies. And I think forcing some compromise and conversation in the Senate is a really good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my side was definitely tilting towards doing something on the filibuster had the results gone a completely different way. Probably in regards to voting rights, probably in regards to women's health, all those types of things. They were definitely leaning that way. The pressure from the activists was there. It's been building. You had, I think, Senator Fetterman's first chief of staff, Adam Jentelson, he wrote a book on why the filibuster should go away. So obviously, yeah, some fairly strong opinions there. I sincerely hope that it stays. I think the pressure will build in the same way that it was building on the Democratic side. You have your base and they're saying, you told us you'd do something about this and you haven't. And the reason why you haven't is because of a rule with a funny name, which is, 200 years old. So why is that what's holding us back from the things that you say are important? I think that same pressure will start to build on the Republican side. I would do think we would be negligent, and people are asking about the Gates nomination and whether or not he'll get confirmed. I think we'd be negligent here if we did not mention, what in essence is being proposed right now by the president, which is it's hard to say if this would be a bigger, destruction of Senate tradition. I would argue that it would be, considering that it's in the Constitution that the Senate is supposed to advise and consent. But if the president is serious about forcing a recess, forcing an adjournment, and when that adjournment happens, confirming his whole cabinet via recess appointment, that's on a different level, I would say, even than the filibuster. I mean, that's, again, a constitutional duty of the Senate, is advise and consent. And as Catherine was saying earlier, we can all point fingers about who started down this road. And I've worked in the Senate. I started in December of 2002. I could go through any number of different points along the way as to who kind of did what. But if we don't get a handle on this, I mean, if this is the way that we're now going to appoint cabinets, just heaven help us. Because what we've seen is that once one side does it, the other never turns it back. They always just kind of keep going with whatever it is. So I think over the coming days, and I really like John Thune. I like the entire Republican leadership team, really. Barrasso is a super smart guy with some great people who work for him, everything. I don't envy them today because they've been put in a pretty tough spot.
I think that's a really fair point, and to the point where Democrats have even been feeling the ripple effects of the Harry Reid tenure. You brought up a really interesting point with that recess appointments, Todd. So let's talk about that a little bit, especially since we have some controversial figures to definitely talk about in the Senate here. Let's not necessarily jump straight into the recess appointments, but without that, do you think Gaetz has a shot of confirmation?
He doesn't need any of my people. I can promise you he's not going to get them. So I'm going to give
Right.
that to
Look, I think it's pretty early to tell, right? I mean, I think that there's no question that every one of the president-elect's nominees will come before the Senate, will get their, nomination hearings, and will go through the process. You saw a number of folks come out yesterday in surprise, in some level of shock. Nobody clearly said, I'm opposed. But today, there was a lot of conversation about we will see how he does at hearings and, when we look at background checks and all that. So I think it's too early to tell either way. To just touch on what Todd was talking about, the recess appointments as well. I don't know if this is that different in a lot of ways than the tariff discussion from the president-elect, right? He tends to throw out a lot of these big blanket ideas as ways to push his agenda, as ways to begin a negotiation. And I think what you saw in the leadership race, right, is everybody embraced the idea that one way or another, the Senate has to be better at processing his noms than they were the first 4 years of his administration, right? President Obama got some recess nominations. It was not that controversial, in Bush and, before that. President Trump got none. His cabinet was pretty slow to develop, through the Senate in a lot of ways. And I think that, there is definitely a desire from some senators to get back to the president should have their qualified people in place, whether you agree with them kind of from a policy perspective or not. So I'm not so sure it's not an opening salvo to make sure that people stick around longer, that Republicans play a little more hardball. And Senator Cornyn, I think, for example, said, we'll just keep people here over the weekends and the holidays if they're going to, obstruct and make us run clock on every single nom. So a lot to be seen, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I mean, for one thing, I think in part why the guy is popular, and I think, Dems need to understand this, is that when he says things, guess what? He typically, if he doesn't do them, he damn sure tries. He said he was going to have a Muslim ban. He tried it. He did. I mean, typically the things that he says, he does. And I mean, and that's to his credit. I mean, he's telling you what he's going to do. People can choose to believe whether or not, they think he's serious about it or not, but generally speaking, he is. When you look at recess appointments, after 2014, after the Supreme Court ruling, those have gone down substantially. Biden, again, I don't think he's had one. And so to kind of go back now and say, oh, well, Obama, oh, well, Bush, or like whatever else, I don't know. And, you know, at a fundamental level, I don't know when I'm be willing to bet within history. We have not had a nominee proposed who was under a House ethics investigation involving minors. And so at that point, if the Senate doesn't have advise and consent, again, look, if that's the way we want to go, fine. But like, to me, there is no bottom. So I understand what Dimitri's saying. I get the frustration. I do think that it's true. Things had gotten out of hand in terms of the president being able to pick his cabinet. As you might remember, it's the reason why Harry Reid did what he did. And so, you know, hopefully Sandy will return, but it's a mess.
Well, and I'm not fully disagreeing with you, Todd. I mean, but one, you know, from my understanding, the president's ability to just put us all in recess by himself is a little bit untested. Two, it requires some situations to be in place, right? And it requires the House and Senate to be disagreeing about adjourning and these different things. So it is not 100% absolute that if he wanted to do it, he could do it, you know, day one. And so one, I think is he serious, or is he trying to build some leverage to get noms through the process faster? And two, even if he is serious and you know, tries to attempt it, is it necessarily successful?
And I think, like, to that point, there's a question in the chat that kind of alludes to this. And Todd, I think this is related to you saying that, you know, Democrats do need to learn a little bit about when Trump says he means, you know, what he says, he goes for it. And I think there's a lot of takes in the post-election analysis about why the campaign didn't yield from the Democratic side the results that at least some of us expected. And there's a question here about why folks like Tammy Baldwin, Ruben Gallegos eked out wins and pulled out wins in the Senate side, but those same people weren't as willing to vote for VP Harris. Where do you think the disconnect is from the top-down level to where people were thinking voting for VP Harris versus like the Senate candidate on ballot? Why do you think the disconnect exists?
Well, I mean, it's very complicated, and we're still in the early stages. And I just want to qualify this by saying, for myself and for the other folks that I know and respect within the party, we get it that, you know, we didn't do well here. You know, I'm going to tell you that I think, you know, that Joe Biden and his administration were uniquely unpopular when you have 70% of the country saying that you're headed in the wrong direction. For, you know, over 2 years. That's a tough election to win as an incumbent. I think, you know, the vice president was burdened with that to a large degree in a way that perhaps Slotkin wasn't, in a way that perhaps Rosen wasn't, Baldwin, you know, they were able to kind of get away from it. But I also do think when you look at a candidate like Alyssa Slotkin, when you look at a candidate like Jackie Rosen was a cocktail waitress in casinos in Nevada. She can speak to the working class. She can, you know, talk to it as being one of them. If you've ever seen Slotkin talking or whatever else, she also was very, very good at that. And I do not believe that at the top of the ticket this year, we had folks who were as good at that. They were already coming from a deficit. They were already coming from, in my opinion, very poor messaging, continually telling people how good the economy was. By the way, I'd just like to interject. I heard my colleague Catherine say we need to do these tax cuts to really jumpstart the economy. We have the best economy in the world. Let's just be clear on that. Right now, the United States has the best economy in the world. The Biden administration, though, did a horrific job of not following that statement up with, but I understand most of you don't feel that way. I understand that most of you are going to the grocery store and you're getting killed. And we're going to do something about that. They didn't do that. They spent, 3 years being very arrogant, telling people that, we had the best economy in the world, which was true. But they weren't following up with, again, like what people actually felt on the ground. I think Slotkin, Rosen, Gallego, all those folks did a way better job of that. They did a way better job of like separating themselves and just saying, no, we get it. We get it. Life is hard right now. and that allowed them to make that difference.
I would add to that a little bit. I mean, I think you saw a little more split ticket voting here than you had in previous years, but in some ways it's a result of the margins being so slim in some of these places, right? Everywhere President Trump, won by, let's say, over 5, the Senate candidates went with the president. It's a lot of these races where it was a 1% margin, a 2% margin, where you saw some differentiation. Some of that is definitely money. In Nevada and Wisconsin, I believe the Senate candidates on the Republican side were outspent 20 and 25 million respectively. In Arizona, outspent $66 million. So that's definitely a piece of it. I think it's also candidates matter, and there were good candidates, that lost certainly on the Republican side, and in some races, there were a little more controversial and not as strong of candidates, and that doesn't help your cause either.
I think that's a really interesting take here too, in terms of like where some of the Democrats need to focus on in terms of like a change in messaging. A little bit more of an empathetic lifestyle. And I think like from that side of things, let's talk a little bit about what the changes from a committee leadership perspective are actually going to mean, which ones that we're watching. And then from there, we'll kind of dive into a little bit of where you see some of the policy stuff going, the legislative priorities going in 2025. So first, I'm curious about both of your takes here on like the committee leadership changes, right? So what significant changes in committee leadership are anticipated with the new Senate composition? We've talked about a couple already. And how do you think the changes like impact the priority list of the legislative processes in the new Senate?
So I can start. I mean, I think it will be more informed by talking about the priorities first a little bit, if you don't mind. And I think, as we've seen with the end of the year discussion, what President Trump's priorities are going to suck up a lot of the energy of what Congress's priorities are, right? So I think in the Senate, we have to see kind of how the end of 2024 plays out from an appropriations perspective, because it's one thing to shift into 2025 and have a clean slate. It's another to shift in and have to finish 24 business, debt ceiling, and all those things. I think outside of that, the 2024 cleanup, the priorities of, again, the House and the Senate really are going to be a lot of the president's priorities. And you're going to have a reconciliation bill, obviously. And so it's whatever the House and Senate can fit into that, whether it's tax, whether it's got border, language in it, whether it's got, repealing some of the President Biden's, agenda and the IRA, parts of Farm Bill. We'll have to get a Farm Bill done. We'll have to get an NDAA done. I think work will definitely continue on infrastructure, hopefully in a bipartisan manner. And then immigration and border security is another big priority. I think additionally, right, no surprise, a huge priority in the new Senate is going to be processing nominations and getting President Trump's appointees in as quickly as possible. I believe there's about 1,200 Senate confirmed political positions to go through. So that's going to take some time, right? And confirming judges is another big priority, just like, Leader Schumer did in the Biden administration. My guess is every spare minute that isn't being used on, key administration noms or legislation is going to be filled processing judges. So I think those are kind of the biggest priorities, right? And then when you look at the committee leadership, I don't know, there are some changes on the Senate Republican side, and I know Todd can mention some of the changes on the Democratic side, but I don't know if it changes those kind of legislative priorities that much, right? So we've got Senator Lee taking over the Energy Committee for Senator Barrasso, who's moving into the whip position. They're both very conservative members. I think they both have a lot in common. I expect, Senator Lee will kind of push the president's priorities in the energy space, just as Senator Barrasso would have. We got a little flip with Senator Grassley going back to the judiciary. But again, anybody there would be kind of working to process the judiciary or the judicial noms as quickly as possible. And Senator Graham taking budget, so leading on kind of reconciliation. And then I think finally the last real change on our side is Senator Rubio, with him kind of ascending into the likely Secretary of State. Senator Cotton will step up and take the Intelligence Committee. So I think that the priorities are kind of the same. I don't see any huge divergence there on the Republican side, at least.
Well, we can be pretty quick on the Democratic side. The priorities are to make life as hard as possible for them. That means slowing things down to the degree you can, which you may not be able to. But I think probably as much as anything, it means trying to point out what we view as the flaws in their policy or whatever else. And so when you're looking at changes in committee chairs, the big one that jumps out to everybody is Senator Warren taking over as the ranking member at banking. I know a lot of people within the financial sector are pretty spooked by that. And I get that. I think probably at this moment, in terms of if you want a kind of attack dog, again, to kind of make life hard, she's probably all right from a Dem perspective, although there was some kind of backroom maneuvering as to whether or not Warner would let go of intelligence to take banking. But last I'd heard that wasn't going to happen. Heinrich takes over at ENR. He's going to love that. Obviously, a lot of stuff in New Mexico that goes through that committee. But other than that, you don't have a whole heck of a lot of changes. I would say, I think as they go through this process for tax reform, if we're talking about like making life hard, probably the way that Democrats, are going to do that is just continually pointing out how much it's going to cost. Because I do believe, I'll tell you right now, that ultimately Republicans are going to have to just eat about $4 trillion in deficit spending. I don't think they're going to find a way to pay for it. And I think the president's going to tell them to do it. And I think Democrats will probably spend a lot of time banging away on that.
Do you think there's any opportunities for Cotton's leadership role here, given kind of his experience? Do you think there's a world in which he's tapped to serve in the administration at some point?
He was certainly floated for DOD. I think he'd be qualified for a number of positions, given his new kind of committee leadership and role in leadership overall. I think that would be a decision for him to make. If asked whether he would want to step out of the new roles to go in. But I think today I don't see the role, but yeah, I think it's certainly possible that if somebody drops out, if somebody's nominee doesn't go through, or somebody serves some time and leaves, he'd be a great candidate to fill some roles in the future.
And flip side too, since we had a couple of questions on that in the Q&A too, talking about Rubio and his kind of ascendancy to potentially serving as Secretary of State, do you think there's any opportunities either for that seat or to work with him given his kind of past work in foreign affairs?
Yeah, I think he was a strong choice there, right? A little bit more in your traditional Republican, viewpoint than I think some of the more MAGA side of the party on foreign policy. It will be interesting to see. DeSantis, I believe, will name a replacement who will then have to run a special in 2 years. Who gets that? I have no idea. But I think given the election results over the last 2 to 4 years in the state, my guess is it's going to be somebody they believe can win in 26 and can be around for a while.
Todd, do you have anything to add there before we go to the next question?
Not in particular. Again, this is the way we are. I will say Tom Cotton is a fellow Arkansan. We graduated high school in the same year. He was about 80 miles down the road. I think that Senator Cotton will continue to angle towards the towards the presidency. So I think that in terms of what he would take and what he wants to do, I would always view it through that lens. He's going to run at some point. He has time because we're both young men.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll always be through that lens.
Happy 22nd birthday, Todd.
Thank you.
Shifting a little bit to the policy side of things, we've heard a lot about two like key social issue topics and kind of interwoven narratives here. Project 2025, international ban on abortion. Project 2025 has been, I would say, like one of the key words for Democratic messaging in terms of what a second Trump administration would bring. And we don't have to tell anyone here that the abortion debate took center spotlight in many of like the campaign's messaging tactics. How much of some of that content, both either on the potential national ban on abortion side, which Trump has said that he wasn't necessarily in favor of, along with more of the other Project 2025 issues, do you see the Senate actually taking on in the first 100 days or beyond of the new Trump administration?
Yeah, I see zero appetite in the Senate for trying to push through a national abortion ban. One, our side is, again, trying to keep the legislative filibuster. You'd need 60 votes for that. I don't think there's 50 votes for that. I don't see it happening. With Project 2025, it was a great boogeyman. But it was what it was. It was a bunch of think tank folks. Sure, some were former Trump administration. Some may try to go in. Many are not going back in, putting ideas on paper that were not sanctioned by the campaign. Some of those ideas, that didn't get the press were much less controversial than others. Some of them are Republican retreads that have been around for a long time and probably would have been ideas in a Nikki Haley, administration. I just don't see it as being like a full sail roadmap that will be followed in every, aspect.
Todd, what's the Democratic take on that?
It was think tanky, but again, a lot of these folks are known quantities and have been around for a while. And a lot of the ideas which were in there were not exactly new. If I had to guess, I don't think it was a boogeyman. I think that they got caught. If I had to guess, I think, that they'll be selective, but I think that there'll absolutely be some things which come out of there. And again, they won't necessarily come out of there because they were in Project 2025. Again, a lot of the stuff that was in there has been around for a while. But there was reluctance to try it either because they were worried about the political impact or maybe even the actual policy impact. They didn't want to take that kind of risk. And I don't think that you're seeing that now. So I would imagine that, it will definitely inform at least some of the thinking. But again, that could be because those ideas were there before, not necessarily because they were packaged up that way.
Right. I think Project 2025 gave it a good book to call it from what chapter, right? Shifting a little.
We thought it was handy from a messaging perspective. We were wrong. So.
Well, lots of learning lessons from the election here. Kind of pivoting a little bit, a couple questions in the chat here that seems like people are paying attention to. Rumors this morning that Senator Paul is going to challenge Bill Cassidy for a help committee. Do we think there's any validity to that? Do we think that's in play?
I think that's an easy one to answer. I'm pretty sure that not very long ago today, Senator Paul made clear that he wanted to stay on Homeland and keep, help with Bill Cassidy. So I don't think we're seeing any challenge there.
That made it easy enough. Cool. Let's move on to the next question here. I know we have just a few minutes left, so a quick 5-minute warning for the audience here. Keep the questions coming. They have been spectacular so far, and we have Dimitri and Todd's time for another few minutes here. So any last minute questions, pop them in the Q&A. We'll get to them if we can. Next question here, kind of a larger picture, kind of public perception and political capital question. How do the recent results and changes in the Senate influence, you think, the public perception of the Republican Party, and what political capital or how much political capital do you think they hold moving forward?
Yeah, again, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think despite a good election night for Republicans, there's no question the country is incredibly divided. So I think the perception really matters on what side of the divide you're talking to. I do think that congressional Republicans, believe that the election resulted really in a mandate for President Trump and his agenda. And so I think that they're going to do their best to push that through. Anytime I think you start a new administration, you have some political capital based on that, right? And generally the first 2 years is where things kind of really get done. This, I think, will be an incredibly interesting 4 years because we haven't had a presidency like this since like the late 1800s, right? Where you're split with an intervening president in the middle. So you do have a lame duck president who can't run again in 4 years. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how that impacts things as well. And then obviously in 2 years, you're going to have midterms. And, as our House colleagues talked about, it will be a little bit tougher for the Senate, the Republicans. There will be, a few tough races, a few potential, offensive opportunities as well. And certainly it's going to be tough in the House. So it really is, I think there's some political capital today. How much of it can you use in these first 2 years to achieve as much of the president's agenda as possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's too bad we only have like 3 minutes. So I'll try and be as quick as possible. I think that as Democrats kind of look at this, one of the polling numbers which came out pretty consistently was that the policies that Democrats were pushing were broadly popular. In fact, they were more popular than the policies that President Trump was pushing. Clearly, we did not do a good enough job of making people feel like either we were going to implement those policies or that to make them feel better. But again, the Dem agenda was kind of broadly popular. I look at the Republican Party right now, and to me, they're in a dream scenario that could turn into a nightmare. And why I say it's a dream scenario is because I don't really know what they are anymore. A lot of the kind of bedrock principles that we consider to be the Republican Party and the Conservative Party have completely shifted with President whenever they want to be, and they're getting ready, and then they're being allowed to be this new thing whenever they want to be here. The next 4 years will be interesting because it'll probably define that a bit more. Right now, the Democrats don't really know what they're shooting at. It changes by the day. And clearly, the American public felt more comfortable going with that than they did with what we were selling. Again, even though it was kind of broadly popular. So, the further definition of the Republican brand, when you look at things like people cared about the border, what did Trump say he was going to do on the border? He said he was going to deport a bunch of people. That's what he said. I mean, there wasn't a whole hell of a lot beyond that. What did he say he was going to do on inflation? I don't even really know. The border, for example, is I'm going to deport a bunch of people, and you're going to see on cable news, wall to wall, people knocking down doors. Well, I think it was reflected in this election that was a better alternative than a known Democratic Party, which people did not think was working.
So, well, there's too much there for me to respond to that I don't necessarily would respectfully disagree with my distinguished colleague over. But I do think it flows nicely into the last question that I see in the chat of who should we be following on social media for political updates? And I think there's probably one person you all should follow that will be guiding a lot of the discussion for the next 2 to 4 years, and that's President-elect Trump, right? People are waiting on his tweets now that he's back on X, Twitter, to figure out where policy's going and what, he's going to be pushing. How, does he want a deal at the end of the year? Or does he want to kick stuff into next year and have more influence over it? I think there's a lot of prognosticating, but nobody knows what he's going to say, and what he's going to say is going to carry the most weight to anybody.
Official statement by President Donald Trump is like the number one tagline on any of the X and Twitter posts. Hit that follow button if you want to know more. I think we have ended our time here. Thank you so much, Dimitri and Todd, for your awesome takes on where we're going to go forward after the Senate elections and Senate leadership elections. Quick plug from the quorum side of things. We have another webinar Monday with tech, healthcare, and energy experts from Axios Pro that will offer a chance to get more in the weeds. So from a policy perspective, if you are in those industries, want to learn more, we will put a link in the chat and send out messages so that you can sign up for that election. Dimitri, Todd, thank you so much for your time here. Really, really had an amazing conversation. Hope both of you have a great rest of your day. And to all the audience who stayed on a couple of minutes late here, thank you so much. And I hope the rest of your afternoon's great. Have a great day, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.